There's a tendency in spiritual culture to speak about the mind as if it's something outside of oneself. And we're typically taught to do this through the process of meditation or through the process of learning to occupy the witness position. Because at a certain point in our lives when emotions and experiences become too overwhelming and we become too identified with them, it does bear some value to develop some objectivity about these things. So typically when you are sitting in meditation or you're asked to observe your mind, observe your thoughts, observe your emotions, you do so by occupying what is known as the witness position. It simply means that you are becoming now actively aware of your own inner phenomena. You're not caught up in them, you're observing them from a somewhat detached perspective. Right? There's a therapeutic value to this, there's a learning value to this, because up until that point, it's quite possible, this is often common for many people, that they have no self-awareness or very little self-awareness, and very little awareness about how the thoughts and emotions function and how they trigger certain sensations and how they trigger certain memories and certain conditioned forms of behavior. So there then becomes a tendency, however, to then speak about everything we're observing and to club it all in this catch-all term that is then called the mind, right? And the mind, depending on who you speak to, everyone has a slightly different definition for what mind is. For some people, mind is the sum total of all their thoughts and perceptions and emotions and sensations. For some, the mind is just the thoughts and emotions. For some, the mind includes thoughts, emotions, sensations, and even awareness. Okay. But essentially, regardless of how you define it, spiritual rhetoric typically tends to become about observing the mind, seeing that the mind is doing what it, behaving as it does, learning to identify how the mind influences your behavior. And there's this subtle bifurcation that happens, a subtle division between myself, who I am, and my mind. Now this separation, in a sense, in some spiritual traditions, is intentional. Some spiritual teachings are trying to point to the fact that who you are is outside the mind, either as some sort of a non-corporeal self, some kind of Atman that transmigrates through incarnations, or it is some sort of nebulous entity called awareness or consciousness, whatever they want to call it, something outside of the mind. And some spiritual traditions are pointing to something they're not entirely sure of, but they're suggesting that who you are exists outside the activity of the mind. All right? And so there's this insinuation at all times that the contents of your mind, the thoughts, the emotions, and all of that are really not congruent with who you are. Who you are is outside of that. Now, you will have some traditions or approaches to spirituality, such as non-duality, in which there's a suggestion that there actually is no such thing as a self. That the self is the emergent phenomenon. It's this sense that arises through the confluence of thoughts, emotions, sensations, and the interactions between them with the physiology of the physical body and the brain, causing a sort of holographic sense of being a self. Regardless, in all of this, the mind becomes this entity that is somehow separate from you. But when you really sit down and you investigate, what is the mind? We use this word for convenience, as we do all words really in the English language. But when you're not thinking, when you're not emoting, what is there? What is remaining? And what most people who tend to view the mind as this sort of separation, the sense of separation between who they are and their minds, have clearly not fully investigated this. Because if you ask them if they identify with their feelings of joy or bliss or calm, peace, equanimity, love, most would often say yes, that is who I am. I am the joy, I am the peace, I am the bliss, I am the love. But when you ask them about the negative emotions, so-called negative, quote-unquote, such as fear, anger, hatred, jealousy, envy, even grief, then often people will say, no, I am not my anger. I am not my sadness. I'm not my jealousy. Those are of the mind. Fear is of the mind, right? And so it's almost a case of wanting to have your cake and eat it too, in that you want to separate yourself from the mind and all its phenomenon, yet at the same time you want to pick and choose. You want to cherry pick which of your mental phenomenon are going to be relegated to that which is not you, and which of them are going to be ascribed to that which is you. Well, the fact is, it's either all mind or none of it is mind. It's either all you or none of it is you. So this idea that we are somehow separate from the mind really holds no water the closer you look into it. As I mentioned, it's a useful tool to sort of, from a psychological standpoint, when suffering gets too much of a burden to bear, to create this separation in order to parse out those aspects of yourself that are still unclear, that are still confused, that are still in pain, and develop some objectivity around those aspects of yourself. In other words, to differentiate yourself from your suffering. But a strategy is all that is. It's not a reflection of the actual state of things. And so once that work has been done, once that work to differentiate yourself from those agents of suffering has been done, then there's still half the job remaining. And that is to put the pieces together. Because the whole has been broken up by you into parts. And now those parts have to be put back together. And that is the process of becoming whole again. That is the process of integrating everything into oneself, including those quote-unquote painful parts. It's what Carl Jung refers to as individuation, which is the integration of the shadow with the self. And what he calls the shadow, and I don't want to get too much into the details of his theories and psychotherapy, but very fundamentally speaking, this is exactly what he was pointing to. The shadow being all parts of ourselves that we do not understand, are not fully aware of, cause confusion, cause pain, cause suffering. This is all what the human mind, the human psyche then relegates to the shadow. It's kind of like, sticking things in the basement of your house, especially things that no longer serve you or you have no use for. You stick them in the basement of your house or somewhere dark, deep in the attic, and there it lies forgotten for several years until somebody rummages through the attic again to find them. So similarly, we have a tendency to shove painful experiences, painful emotions deep down into the recesses of our psyche, into the basements and attics of our psyches. And that's where they lie, in the shadows. But the thing is, those energies continue to contribute to the ways in which we move, the ways in which we live, the ways in which we act. They actively influence our decisions in ways in which we don't even understand, because we're not conscious of them. We're not aware of them anymore because they've been relegated to the shadows. And so this technique of parsing out the mind from who we are in order to then investigate these difficult things is a useful technique, because it's like willingly going down into the basement and rummaging through it, or going into the attic and rummaging through it and seeing what's there and understanding why you are influenced the way you are. But what then happens as a result of this approach is a certain bypassing, because it then says, but then I am not the mind. That's like saying, oh, but the basement is not part of my house, or my attic is not part of my house. That's not my living space. My living space is my house. The attic and the basement, they belong to somebody else. They're liabilities that unfortunately are attached to this structure, but they're not really my home. But that's living in denial, because your home is the sum total of all rooms in the house. It includes the attic, it includes the basement, it includes all of that. And so what's necessary is not only to see what's there, but to fully accept and integrate what's there, to realize that everything that's sitting there in the attic and the basement is in fact yours. It belongs to you. That home is who you are in its totality. And when you go through that process of integration, you come to realize that there is no such thing as a mind. There is no such thing as a self that is separate from the mind. There is no such thing that even words like thoughts and emotions and sensations, well, these are just words. All there truly, truly, truly is this unending experience of what it feels like to be, which takes on the form, various manifestations, various forms, and we use different words to describe these forms. But it really is this one single stream of experience, of phenomena. And that is essentially who we are.